please know that we're going to get to some Q&A in a little bit, and we'll be able to unmute yourself so you can ask some questions. I'm Jay Sexton. I think I know everybody on here, but many of you are probably accustomed to Jeff running these seminars. Jeff's our real inning eater, but even an inning eater like Jeff Pasley needs a night in the bullpen. So he's icing his shoulder. He's in the bullpen tonight, but I bet you he's going to run out onto the mound for a question towards the end. I'm going to introduce our speaker in just a second, and I'm going to give him a little heads up now. I'm going to embarrass him with praise, so you can look forward to that in a second, Mike. But what I wanted to say first was actually something about the topic matter. And the topic matter of the Caribbean as it fits into broader historical patterns and is understood by those of us on the call, which most of us are either doing Atlantic history or rooted in sort of US history. And I got a good thing and a bad thing to say about how we fit or don't fit the Caribbean in. The good thing is that I think it's impossible to talk about the Caribbean in any kind of historiographically informed way, or indeed to talk about the United States and the colonies which preceded it in any kind of informed way without placing the Caribbean absolutely at the center of that story. And our colonial historians have done a great job of integrating the Caribbean into their studies. And indeed, in more recent times, scholars of the 19th century have. In fact, you can't really write seriously about the origins of the Civil War now without taking into account the fate of slavery in the Caribbean. And that goes for the British Caribbean as well as for the French. So that's the good news. The bad news, as I understand it, is that when you move chronologically forward in time, okay, when you get into the late 19th and into the 20th century, sort of Caribbean and its connections to the North American mainland and really its place in the broader Atlantic system kind of drops off of everyone's radar screens. That's not to say there aren't people who write really good, interesting, important stuff about it. It's just that those who are writing in the more traditional national historical vein don't pay attention to it. And I think that ought to change. For though the geopolitics of the Caribbean definitely changes in the 20th century, I think its importance to broader currents does not. And one thanks here in particular of cultural stories as well indeed as political and intellectual ones, which leads us to our speaker today, Mike Joseph, the Brock Fellow of Modern History at Corpus Christi College, Oxford. Mike, it's great to have you here. I want to say two things about Mike's scholarship, as I understand it, as someone who's sort of dabbled in it. I want to say two things about that, and then I'll get to that embarrassment that I promised him. The first thing that's really cool about his scholarship is how he looks at the Caribbean in a sort of big picture sense. And in particular, he's looking at the late 19th and he's looking at the first half of the 20th century. In particular, he's looking at both the British and the French Caribbean. And I think that's really exciting. It's really important. He's looking at the common sort of rhythms and patterns of political change, but he's also keeping an eye out on the differences, the different political outcomes, some just good old-fashioned comparative analysis and assessment. My second point about what I think is cool about his scholarship is how Mike is part of what I think is a kind of trend in this field, particularly of younger scholars who are completely redefining what constitutional history means. And all of us at the Kinder Institute, I think, should take particular note of that. He's widening out constitutional history as it's understood. He's redefining the field. And in particular, the big move, at least as I understand it, is linking something that we know a lot about but don't often think about in constitutional terms, and that is anti-colonialism, linking anti-colonialism and constitutionalism together, something I think any historian of the United States would be well served to do as well. Now to the embarrassing thing I want to say to him. Uh, Mike, the biggest compliment I can give anybody, and I'm going to give it to you, and I mean it, the biggest compliment I can give to anyone is that they're a committed educator. I mean, research is important. We write books and we do all that, but at the end of the day, we're here to be educators, and you're a committed educator. I know this because for those of you who don't know, Mike's a sort of a point man who looks after some of our Missouri exchange students and visiting students that go over there, and he's got a million things to do, I'm sure, and this is just one little teeny little piece of the puzzle. But all the students always come back saying how fantastic he is, how committed he is to their intellectual development. So I'd like to thank you on behalf of the University of Missouri for all that you've done for that. And then the last thing I'll say is that you're also a committed educator coming here to educate us about the Caribbean, because you're operating on British time. It's Friday night. It is 9:37 for Mike Joseph. 9:37. I mean, if he should be at the pub, well, I don't know if the pubs are even open anymore. So maybe we got lucky there. But with that being said, I'm sure you want me to shut up so you can get your paper done. We have a slight change to the title today. The title is The First World War, Reimagining of Empire in the French and British Caribbean. Mike Joseph, over to you.
Thank you so much for that really kind introduction. I was going to mention before the start that I was sort of thrilled to see a couple of familiar faces in the audience, students that I remember from earlier years at Oxford. So it's just brilliant to have them here, and it's brilliant to have you all here. So thank you so much. I'm going to attempt to share my screen in a way which doesn't give away all my state secrets in the notes. I don't know if you can you see the slides, but hopefully not any of my notes and things. Perfect, excellent. We work with a different sort of online package in Oxford, so Zoom is a bit unfamiliar for me. So thank you again, as I say, all of you for being here, and to the University of Missouri for hosting me, and particularly to Jay Sexton for his very kind invitation to speak. I'm afraid that I'm guilty of a little false advertising, as Jay mentioned. I'm currently writing a book about anti-colonial thought in the British and French Caribbean between 1884 and 1939. It's a comparative study which is broadly interested in two entwined themes. One of those is the evolution during these years of new forms of popular anti-colonialism around the island's local assemblies. And the other is the fluctuations during these years of the island's sugar and rum industries within the context of the turmoil experienced by the world sugar economy during this period of global depressions and wars. My intended paper was, as it's titled, suggested a chapter from that book manuscript. But like many of the sort of best laid plans, I'm sorry to say that chapter has had to be shelved while I move my teaching online and generally cope with life in lockdown Britain. So instead, I brought along a selection of characters from my PhD thesis, many of whom won't be finding a home in the book. So I'm a bit of a loss at what to do with them. And so I'm looking forward, hopefully, to seeing if you guys have any ideas, and yeah, hopefully having a good discussion after this talk. So on the 2nd of October 1915, the 1st St. Lucia contingent of the British West Indies Regiment formed up in Columbus Square, Castries, for a farewell address from the acting governor. The local newspaper, The Voice of St. Lucia, reported that some 4,000 St. Lucians were present at the wharf as evening fell and the hour of departure neared. Each man, The Voice continued, carried a serviceable kit bag in which to stow his belongings, and more than one shouldered, as if they were rifles, lengths of sugarcane, bent on having a last chew of this familiar and succulent product of the island. Friends and family mingled with the contingent men on board, and one and all were united for a chorus of "It's a Long Way to Tipperary," one of the British Army's most famous marching songs from the war. The historiography on the Caribbean in the war, whether concerned with the British or the French Caribbean, but particularly in the British case, I think, has been preoccupied with these men. their experiences at the front, the thorny question of their identity, and how this handful of veterans, their perspective on the imperial relationship indelibly marked by their military service, led the way towards decolonization. Today, though, I want to argue that we can learn much and possibly more about the war and its impact on Caribbean politics from looking not at our departing St. Lucians, but at the sugarcane that they were carrying. Here it might help to have a sort of brief aside on the global history of the First World War. Historians have become very adept at finding the global in the local, as I think we all know. The way that we view the Western Front in the First World War has changed dramatically in recent times. As they hunkered down in Flanders fields, the British Tommies scooped Argentinian bully beef from cans made of Malayan tin, unloaded by Chinese laborers, and they watched as shells manufactured using Chilean nitrates and loaded by Caribbean soldiers soared overhead. And yet to globalize the history of the war in this way doesn't disrupt the singularity of this narrative that we have, which presupposes the war's 1914 to 1918 chronology, its major players, its European center of gravity, and so on. These global histories are histories of how men and materiel were drawn into the military service of the great powers in Europe, or else they're histories of how mainly colonial soldiers were put to work in less familiar contexts, Mesopotamia, Germany, East Africa, and so on. And these are seen as kind of interesting sideshows, but sideshows nonetheless. This is global history as a sort of additive process whose ambition is to add to or to kind of refine rather than to challenge the singular or grand narrative that we have. The issue, I think, is that if this is our starting point, if our starting point is that the war was only a military conflict centered on Europe, then the colonies can only ever be peripheral to that. Wartime military activity in the Caribbean lasted for approximately 3 months and ended with a single German warship in the region spontaneously combusting in November 1914. If this is our starting point then, that the war was not in the Caribbean, then we can only trace its effects in those who we imagine did experience the war, hence the focus in the literature on the experiences of colonial soldiers and veterans. I want to suggest, though, that the global history of the war should endeavour not only to refine this one particular understanding, but to offer new ones which decenter Europe, embrace alternative timelines, and don't privilege the conflict's military dimensions. This means working not to make the Caribbean fit into the history of the war, but making the war fit into the history of the Caribbean. So let's return to our British Tommy sitting in the trenches. We can trace the sprawling networks of commodities which went into sustaining his presence at the front back to their sources. Many of these supply chains existed well before the war, but the mobilization, or the demands rather, of total war and mass mobilization transformed them. I've been inspired really particularly here by the work of Tate Keller. And as he points out, tin mining in the Malaysian peninsula, thousands of miles from the Western Front, was transformed by the war. The intensification of production driven by wartime demand displaced local populations and it destroyed local ecologies, all in a place that we would think pretty much untouched by the war's effects. But for these Malaysian tin miners, the war didn't happen over there. It was very much something happening to them at home. So if we return to the Caribbean, I guess I'm interested in what happens when we think about the war as an economic event, a period in which imperial economies, with all of the power dynamics that that phrase implies, were mobilized in ways which radically affected daily life in the colonies. And I think the war offers an excellent vantage point from which to see empire at work. And if we want to think through the war's political effects, we need to think about it in much more far-reaching structural ways. So today, or this evening for me, I want to suggest that the dominant ways in which Caribbean political and social elites reimagined empire in these years were shaped by political economic considerations about the potential future of small islands with staple industries which, at a global level, were uncompetitive, but which were transformed by the war. So to put it another way, how could these islands, whose populations numbered in the hundreds of thousands at the very most, and often less, make their way in the world? Why am I focusing on sugar so much? Well, fundamentally because it's the island's most important wartime export. Collectively speaking, it's the largest employer, and it had an emotional pull unrivaled by any other commodity. The industry's revival was the dream that never died throughout the interwar years. It was the focal point for major labor unrest in the 1930s, which in the British case acts as a kind of staging post towards decolonization in much of the literature. And finally, in the spirit of this of what Jay was talking about in terms of the comparison, I think it kind of offers a really valuable point of comparison between the British and French empires. So I'll begin by exploring a little of what made the war an event of such lasting economic importance for the Caribbean, before delving into each case in turn, the British and then the French. So by the time that the war broke out in August 1914, the islands of the British and French Caribbean had been in decline for some time. Caribbean sugar, once the jewel in the imperial crown, was increasingly uncompetitive in the face of growing competition from rival cane producers like Java and Cuba. Just as damagingly, the European beet sugar industry had expanded enormously from the mid-19th century, thanks largely to protective bounties imposed by France, Belgium, Germany, Austria, and others, which allowed this sugar to be sold below the cost of production. By 1874, Britain had abolished all import duties on sugar and fully embraced beet sugar from Europe. France, meanwhile, celebrated the beet industry as one of its, quote, industrial glories, to quote the Minister for Agriculture in 1882. And it provided the ailing, increasingly uncompetitive Antillean cane industry with little of the support given to the wine producers of the south of France, when it was struggling in these years against kind of phylloxera, so a sort of vine disease. In both cases, then, the island's interests were sacrificed in favour of cheaper sugar for metropolitan Britons and French. What was the impact of this? Well, some headline figures would include that infant mortality, so before the age of 1 in Barbados, peaked at 420 per thousand in 1906. In Britain's most poverty-stricken districts at this point, it was about 150 per thousand. And Barbados's population fell from 182,000 in 1891 to 156,000 in 1921. As thousands flooded overseas, largely to Panama, Trinidad, or Cuba, to escape the grinding poverty at home. Agricultural wages in Jamaica remained, even in nominal terms, essentially the same in 1910 as they had been at the end of the apprenticeship system in 1838. And in St. Lucia, common labourers lived in what one official called mud and wattle huts with earth floors, much like this one that you can see here, which generally would house several generations of the same family at once. Now, the war is this kind of deus ex machina, this sort of bolt from the blue, which promised to solve this seemingly unsolvable problem. As armies began to march across Europe and the environmental devastation of northeastern France and Belgium began, beet sugar, which had been produced in these areas, retreated from the international market, and cane sugar from the Caribbean returned to the fore. Britain and France needed sugar for their armies and for the home front, and France used rum for manufacturing munitions. Rescued from international obscurity and unprofitability, rum and sugar became, as one commentator put it in 1931, nothing less than war industries, and the effect on the Caribbean was nothing short of transformative. In the French case, rum benefited the most. You don't have to be any sort of expert in statistics to see what this graph shows. Adjusted for inflation, the unit price of rum on the French market rose by 860% from 1913 to 1919. And there were significant repercussions, not just for kind of prices, but also then for the shape of the sugar and rum industries in these islands. As we can see here, the share of Guadeloupe's cane processed by sugar factories falls from 89% to about 72%. And the proportion of the island's rum output coming from factories also falls from about 74% to about 60%. From 45 agricultural distilleries, so distilleries which are independent of the sugar factories and which manufactured rum using cane juice, in 1912, we moved to 79 in 1922, this sort of big explosion in the number of these smaller distilleries. And in Martinique, where rum production is even more important, the number of distilleries almost doubles from 73 in 1913 to 141 in 1920. So kind of the big headline takeaway from all of these figures is that there's a really significant reorientation of the industry away from sugar and towards rum production. Another major effect comes at the level of the workforce. The high price of cane allows more and more small planters to gain total independence from salaried work. In leaner times, so for most of the 19th century, most would work their own plot of land and on a seasonal basis also hire themselves to a plantation or to the plantation of a local sugar factory for wage labor. But during the war, once cane starts to fetch such high prices, many find that they're now able to avoid this kind of onerous, task-based salaried work. And to do so is actually seen as a sign of social mobility. Again, it's really worth stressing here that we're dealing with a hugely rapid transformation. So where in 1911, these small planters had provided just 10% of the cane processed by the Saint Mark's factory on Guadeloupe's southeastern tip, by 1918, they're providing 38%, so almost 4 times as much. And notably, this new wave of distilleries were, for the most part, without significant plantation land of their own. As such, they were supplied and their growth was driven by these small planters. In the British Caribbean, sugar was the prime beneficiary, but we see similar structural changes. From 11,500 tonnes per year in 1913, Jamaica's sugar output surged to 59,000 tonnes in 1928, and it would continue to spiral in the next couple of decades as global consumption rose. And the war, again, is the principal driver here. It's accelerating processes whose roots lie further back into the 19th century, but it's a kind of catalyst which fundamentally changes things. In structural terms, the parallels with the French Caribbean are very clear. The war years see a sort of rapid reorientation, at least in some areas, towards independent cane farming by small planters who could now afford to withdraw their labour from the plantations. Westmoreland Parish in Jamaica provides a really good example of this. So in 1911, 80% of the land planted in cane was cultivated by estates. By 1921, this figure had fallen to about 45%. Increasing centralization in production helped to propel this shift beyond the war years. Wartime profits allowed long overdue centralization to take place in Jamaica. Small estates with their kind of individual factories were amalgamated and reorganized into farms which produced cane for a large central factory. So where in 1896 there had been 137 factories in Jamaica, by 1926 their number had fallen to just 38, but on average these were producing 10 times the amount of cane. Now, another paper which I could have given and promised that I would give would sort of trace how these structural changes shaped Caribbean politics into the interwar years. Labor relations were social relations. So in Jamaica, for example, this centralization was also marked by a shift in ownership patterns over the ensuing years and the growing dominance of foreign multinationals and limited liability companies, whose labor regimes kind of proletarianized the agricultural labor force in a way. And given that the labor unrest of the 30s is generally seen as this sort of staging post on the way to independence, there's clear significance here. Or we could think about this in terms of land. So the organic shift in favor of small planters was celebrated by the French Caribbean's socialist press as kind of this almost emancipatory move. So these workers had, one letter to Guadeloupe's Le Nouveliste put it, been liberated from the factory. In the British Caribbean, where, with the exception of Barbados, there were vast areas of crown lands owned by the state, the creation of a black peasantry, as it was called, could be made an object of policy through land settlement schemes. In Jamaica, for example, the land settlement scheme offered to British West Indies Regiment veterans in 1919 began its life as an altogether more ambitious plan for state-led, scientific, rationally organised agriculture, in which the men would act as model settlers under the auspices of the Department of Agriculture. So there are the ways in which kind of this shift in the structure of production shifts how people are thinking about labor, how they're thinking about the distribution of land, and kind of so many other things besides. And today, though, we're kind of more concerned with the big imperial visions which emerge from these shifting economic conditions. And from all of the kind of many statistics that I've thrown at you, we need only to kind of retain the idea that these shifts are big and that they're seen as being very, very exciting by people at the time. It's a complete reversal in the economic fortunes of the British and the French Caribbean. And much of what is imagined politically during the war years is about finding ways to preserve this good fortune. So in the British Caribbean, the war was seen as a fundamental turning point. To understand the conflict and the space of possibility which it opened meant reaching back into the 19th century and to a story of decline which could be narrated through the slow decay of a once great industry, sugar. What had once been told as a tragedy became, with the revival of the sugar industry, a story with yet to be written chapters and open-ended possibilities. Speaking at a patriotic rally organised by St. Lucia's Agricultural and Commercial Society in August 1916, the island's Attorney General, a metropolitan-born official called George O'Donnell Walton, exemplified this tendency to weave the war into a longer economic story. So as he says, 2 years of war, but we in the West Indies have known for 2 decades and more the awfulness of another form of war. It seems to be the custom of Germans to make commercial war as a prelude to actual war. The one is not so evident as the other, but is also far-reaching and destructive. Their ways are slim and underhand, and they sought first to strangle the world financially and then dominate it by force of arms, like a huge octopus, to embrace all in a relentless grip. We've experienced this form of war in our sugar industry. We could not compete with bounties, with government-aided and subsidized railways, steamships, and all the other services to drive a trade opponent out of business. Mills in ruins, fertile fields in scrub brush, homes broken up, scattered families, all testify to this sort of war. So Wharton gave his audience a story with a distinctively Caribbean flavour, but he spoke to a commonly voiced aspect of wartime anti-German narratives, namely that Britain had been caught unawares by an enemy who, quietly and covertly, had paved the way for their military assault with decades of commercial and economic warfare. The lesson that people were drawing then for the post-war period was that imperial autarky, so self-sufficiency, was desirable and indeed inevitable if Britain were to protect itself. Speaking to the West India Club on the 10th of August 1917, the Colonial Secretary, Walter Long, stressed that the empire would need to become, in his words, more united and more completely self-supporting than it had ever been before. The British Empire Producers Organisation and the Empire Resources Development Committee were two institutional manifestations of this new widespread faith in imperial economic reform. Free trade, which had summoned such passionate support around the turn of the century, seemed to many, in Britain and in its colonies, to have led the empire into danger, luring it into reliance on German raw materials and manufactures. In Trinidad's Legislative Council, a July 1916 resolution calling for empire-wide protectionist legislation, proposed ironically enough by a member named Adam Smith, revived some of this bitterness. The governor, Sir John Chancellor, told the council that he'd been a free trader until the outbreak of war, but Germany's plotting, he said, had surely absolutely destroyed the principle of unrestrained free trade. No school of political opinion was so dead as the Manchester School, he said. Everything economic was in the melting pot. So what therefore made this moment so exciting for the British Caribbean was that it seemed to mark a watershed in British economic policy between a laissez-faire past which had devastated the island's main industry and obstructed their development, and a more protectionist future which promised to redress this neglect. Nobody expected the high prices fetched by sugar to last forever. The Port of Spain Gazette predicted 2 or 3 fat years in 1914. But as 2 years turned to 3 and 3 turned to 4, optimism grew. Debts could be paid off, antiquated machinery modernized, and a bright future imagined. I don't think we can overstress the meaning attached to the sugar industry as the institution of the West Indian Golden Age, whose decline had also been that of the island as a whole. So its sudden recovery seemed like the opportunity to recover something of the island's former glory. And for workers, its sudden recovery seemed like the opportunity to finally be paid a sort of decent wage for their work. Other agricultural exports also enjoying high wartime prices like cocoa, though, garnered almost no attention by comparison. So there is something kind of very particular here going on with sugar as a sort of this kind of historic product of the West Indies Golden Age. There was a general consensus, though, that the long-term future of the industry rested on securing imperial preference, which is to say preferential tariffs on British Caribbean sugar. The beet industry, after all, would be back, and behemoths like Cuba and Java showed little sign of slowing down. But the island's commercial and agricultural interests were well aware of their place in the imperial pecking order. Even a fully self-sufficient empire didn't necessarily mean a prosperous West Indies if they lost out, as they had before, to other colonies. So Jamaica's Daily Gleaner, in pressing for government-funded central factories, reflected that we're doing magnificently in sugar just now. We shall continue to do magnificently for some time yet. But the empire is large, and after this war, the people of England will be poor in comparison with what they were before the war. They'll desire to develop the resources of their empire, but they will not extend general benefits to specific portions of the empire unless each of those specific dependencies can prove that it's not merely seeking to get all that it can out of the British consumer as the price of its patriotism during the war. This was where the economic and the political converged. If the islands had drawn one lesson from the past, it was not, as one might expect, that Britain would always move to protect its metropolitan citizens before its colonial subjects, but rather that individually the islands were too small to thrive on an increasingly crowded world stage. A Jamaica or a Trinidad, and still less a much smaller St. Lucia or a Grenada, couldn't make their voice heard and press home their claims for imperial preference. The political visions which circulated during the war years were all, on some level, about addressing this question of scale. And in many cases, they rested quite explicitly on some form of imperial partnership as the safeguard of the island's economic future. So I've got three examples to run through for you. First is the now rather improbable sounding dream of a Canada-West Indies Federation. At the time, this didn't appear quite as bizarre as it might now. Many of the islands had, since 1912, had reciprocal trade agreements in place with Canada, and various commercial interests had for some time encouraged some form of political union between them. It was only with the war, though, that the Canadian government began to take real interest. The other dominions were hoovering up former German colonies in the Pacific and Africa, leaving Canada casting covetous looks down at the West Indies. The Department of State, in fact, drew up a confidential memorandum on what it called the annexation of the West India Islands, which concluded that it, quote, behooves Canada to consider in what measure she can best secure an equivalent to those territorial advantages which she will be glad to see her sister dominions acquire. Coming of age as a white nation, it was thought, meant not just home rule, but possessing tropical colonies of one's own. The West Indies, the memorandum concluded, were a desirable target, and Canada's Prime Minister, Robert Borden, even raised the matter to some approval at an Imperial War Cabinet meeting. Of the islands, it was Jamaica where enthusiasm was most apparent, although there were also positive sounds emerging from Barbados. While it lasted, the scheme was a clear example of the type of marriage of convenience into which many prominent West Indians were willing to enter, a political arrangement which in many respects was profoundly illogical. But as a means of amplifying the Caribbean's voice in the empire and securing both a profitable outlet for its agricultural products and a much needed investment in their production, the scheme seemed perfectly sensible. The destiny of the British Empire, the Daily Gleaner told its readers in April 1916, is clearly to be a confederation of free peoples, each as far as may be a perfect political and economic whole. Canada then must have tropical adjuncts, must have provinces producing those commodities which are the raw material of manufactories in temperate climes. The idea of political union, however, had lost much of its luster by the armistice. Canada, it became clear, had little intention of expanding Black West Indians' political rights, and a press storm of some well-documented colour bars in Canadian medical schools rapidly dampened Caribbean enthusiasm. Our second and third example, which centred on the idea of a West Indian federation, had much greater longevity. This federal goal came in many guises and from people with very different political sensibilities. On the one hand, and quite similar to what we see with the Canada example, the island's agricultural and commercial interests championed federation for largely economic reasons. The Associated Chamber of Commerce of the West Indies held its inaugural meeting in February 1917 in Port of Spain, drawing together representatives from Trinidad, Barbados, British Guiana, Grenada, St. Lucia and Kitts, St. Vincent and Montserrat. It was a loose commercial federation designed to distill opinion from across the region and to campaign for protectionist measures. Its founder, the Guyana-based sugar proprietor Edward Ray Davson, had complained after attending the British Imperial Council of Commerce in 1916 that the West Indies are, quote, handicapped in comparison with other parts of the empire in not being able to speak with a united voice. So the Associated Chamber, its eye on imperial preference in particular, aimed to address this problem. Many attendees, however, wished to go still further, forming the West Indian Federal League to promote a loose form of political federation, which would allow for kind of mutual action in common interests, as they put it, with a considerable degree of autonomy retained by each constituent colony. Davson predicted that the Imperial War Cabinet would develop into an annual conference with members of the empire assembled to discuss with the cabinet the way the empire should be conducted. His dream, therefore, was that, quote, someday we will see a West Indian Commonwealth taking its place with equal status among the other dominions of the empire. These visions were strictly pragmatic, aiming essentially to boost the island's commercial bargaining power. The Grenadian journalist and Black nationalist T.A. Marichaud, on the other hand, inscribed the idea of a West Indian Federation in a sort of eschatological schema in which the divinely ordained decline of European civilization was to give way to a new age of interracial cooperation. On a practical level, though, this looked much like the common belief that the post-war empire would be restructured as a partnership among equal self-governing units, and that the island's rightful place at the top table relied on their banding together to form a unit of appreciable size and importance. If we hope to be represented in the future Imperial Parliament, we cannot remain as we are, Marichaud told his readers in August 1917. We can all have our local legislators, but we must have the voice of one in the council that will guide the destinies of Britain's people scattered all over the world. Now, the islands didn't federate, not until 1958, that is, but they did get imperial preference. The Jamaica Imperial Association passed a resolution to register its profound relief and satisfaction at the news, but it couldn't resist a warning shot across Britain's bows. And I quote, Jamaica was reduced to a serious condition through the adoption by England of a free trade policy, which enabled the German nation to ruin the sugar industry of Jamaica and of other British West Indian colonies by a system of sugar bounties, deliberately intended to bring about the displacement of British-grown sugar by German sugar. Britain would do well to remember these so-called mistakes in future, for, as they put it, the enduring unity of the empire depends on the solidarity of its material interests, as expressed in its trade relations and its commercial and economic interdependence, as well as its loyalty to the throne and on the sentiments and traditions which each and every part of it shares with the whole. So this is, I think, kind of as clear as we could possibly want it. A statement from the Jamaica Imperial Association, which counted its members from the planters, merchants, and professionals who formed the island's main political class, that their loyalty was as pragmatic as much as it was patriotic. Preference, though, proved, if not a dead letter, of at most marginal value. Production expanded, but Caribbean sugar still paid 5/6 of the normal import duty, a slim preference which didn't even allow most producers to break even. And the policy was preyed to the ebb and flow of metropolitan politics. Despite forging ties with the nascent labour movement in Trinidad, Britain's Labour Party proved to be preference's greatest enemy, consistently reining in and reversing conservative protectionism in defence of lower prices for the metropolitan working classes. Enthusiasm for imperial autarky, meanwhile, had dwindled rapidly as post-war conditions at home and abroad largely put paid to the emergence of any radical nationalist economic policy. But a 1/6 reduction on import duty was better than nothing, and more favourable than the islands could secure outside the empire, and so preference was hardly this kind of line in the sand. Far better to campaign for its strengthening, as the islands did, than to risk their fortunes alone. The dream of federation didn't die, but securing preference in 1919 robbed it of support from most of the commercial and agricultural interests I've mentioned. It became instead the sole preserve of those like Marichaud or the war veteran and labour leader A.A. Cipriani in Trinidad, who had always seen in it more than just a tool for economic bargaining. In the French Caribbean, what we see is something quite different. There's an important contrast in political thought here, specifically the degree to which French republicanism offered a coherent framework for imagining and then articulating the impact which military service in the war would have. To cut a long story short, in France under the Third Republic, military service has come to be seen as the core duty of citizenship. As a duty, it was almost contractual. The greatest of the citizens' duties exchanged for the rights of citizenship, foremost among them the right to vote. Middle-class Antillians had therefore long sought compulsory military service as the cornerstone of their assimilation. Once France conceded it in 1913, they reasoned no one could contest their right to be seen as full citizens. This meant that there was kind of rather less focus in the Antilles on how to lobby the so-called mother country for particular benefits, or how to find creative ways of amplifying the island's voice in the world. Assimilation, it was thought, was more or less secured and would solve both of these problems. What we do see, however, is just how fragile was what appeared to be, and is generally portrayed by historians as, a complete consensus about assimilation, and how far it rested on pragmatism as well as patriotism. Sugar and rum had become war industries, and as such were subject to interventions by the imperial state, designed to secure supplies and rationalise production. Indeed, the very price rises which had helped to reshape the production process and allow dreams of smallholding peasantry to take root owed much to state requisitioning, absorbing between 1/4 and 1/2 of total production, depending on the year, and carried out well below the market rate and at irregular intervals. Requisitioning had encouraged speculation by metropolitan buyers, and therefore huge price rises. But state intervention could also be deeply troubling. As much as it suited Antillean politicians' assimilationism to suggest otherwise, Antillean interests were not the same as French interests. A number of interventions over the course of the last year or so of the war brought this into stark relief, and drew into the open hitherto quietly voiced doubts about the shape of the imperial relationship. The first of these came in October 1917. Seeking to redirect the industry's production away from rum and back towards sugar, the imperial government announced a decision to requisition all colonial rum at a price described by La Paix, Martinique's most widely circulated daily newspaper, as derisory, hoping thereby to push producers back towards sugar. A joint response from Martinique's planters and rum producers unions echoed a statement made by the Member of Parliament, Joseph Lacosilliere, the latter's president. The industry would gladly fulfill its patriotic duty by producing as much sugar as possible, but what they called fairness, and indeed the realities of production, dictated that rum production could not be restricted. Suspicions abounded, however, that there was more to the government's decision than there appeared. At a meeting hastily arranged by the governor, the mayor of Fort-de-France and the former parliamentarian Victor Sever suggested that metropolitan interests had again been put above those of the Antilles. As he said, the great rum buyers in the metropole happily accepted the high prices, while their low-price contracts with colonial producers allowed them to make enormous profits. But today, when most of these contracts have expired, the powerful buyers syndicate has not hesitated to put pressure on the government to monopolize rum at derisory prices, so as to later make great profits. It is quite simply blackmail. Only 2 months later, the imperial government intervened again, this time with a decree which banned the import of sugar, molasses, and alcohols from foreign sources into Martinique and Guadeloupe. Profits had been such that the island's cane production couldn't keep up with the sugar industry's ambitions, and so the islands imported vast quantities of molasses to enable greater and greater volumes of rum to be produced. The ban's rationale was threefold. Shipping was limited. French customs officials were eager to crack down on a process which essentially allowed these foreign molasses to circumvent higher rates of import duty. And of course, it was hoped that the island's sugar industries would redirect their energies away from rum and back towards sugar. Now, this was a measure which had very real and potentially very dangerous implications for the islands. The import duty alone on Martinique's molasses imports brought over £1 million a year into the local treasury. These molasses were destined mainly for the great industrial distilleries. Wounding the island's largest employers would have an obvious domino effect on salaries, workers' purchasing power, and so on, which promised further damage to the budget. The Conseil General, the local parliament, was forced to cut back on public spending. Hardly prone to hysteria, La Paix, the newspaper of the local bishopric, described the crisis unleashed by the molasses ban as the most sudden and brutal in Martinique's 300-year history. No small claim for an island which had seen its cultural and economic capital, Saint-Pierre, completely destroyed in 1902 by one of the deadliest volcanic eruptions in recorded human history. Then in February 1918, at the height of the sugar harvest, the importation of all Antillean rum to France was suddenly banned. Where the previous ban had hit the great factory lake distilleries, this new measure threatened the existence of the new independent distilleries. Now, in the end, the government was forced to back down somewhat with a series of concessions, and the intricacies of those have absolutely no bearing on what we're talking about here. But basically, producers were eventually permitted to export their stocks as planned. What's more important to us is the reaction which these measures provoked. As with the events of 1917, the crisis seemed to pit Antillean interests against French interests, and this triggered increasingly critical reflections on the imperial relationship. The Antillean press understood the imposition of compulsory military service in 1913 as a last substantive step towards assimilation. There was, they argued, no question that they were French citizens. And yet France's actions seemed to challenge this. As Lagrosselière asked, which French region would be so ruined from one day to the next without any consideration whatsoever, even if the national interest demanded it? Of course, the expansion of the rum industry had been driven above all by profit, but they could nonetheless claim, as we saw with Lagrosselière and the joint statement from the Rum and Sugar Producers Union, that it had been an act of patriotism. The socialist politician and journalist Hildebert Adolphe Lara, writing in Guadeloupe's Le Nouvelliste, summed up this sense of betrayal. As he put it is important that our small planters are not ruined by measures which they were not expecting. The government gave them the instruction to intensify their production because France, they were told, needed everything which the colonies produced. They set to work with enthusiasm and tenacity, and it's well known how the colonies have supplied the mother country. How can colonial goods be suddenly prohibited without taking into account the efforts made, the capital exposed, the interests in play? In short, France's actions were seen to threaten the very future which the rum industry's boom had promised. The ban would nip in the bud the political vision of an Antillean citizenry reconstituted around small and middling planters. Some reward, they thought, their patriotism and supposed status as French citizens. It was only a short leap from recognizing that Antillean and French interests didn't always align to questioning the limits of citizenship itself. Let the state requisition rum, it's its right, wrote Lara, but that it requisitions it at a derisory price, and especially that it pronounces the death of the distilleries situated around the factories or established since the start of the war, that is something which our patriotism cannot accept. And I should stress at this point that to find statements like this in the mainstream press, particularly during the heightened patriotic fervor of the war years, is kind of remarkable and doesn't happen at any other point. So for all the wartime rhetoric of patriotism, when it came down to it, it seemed that Antilleans' loyalty was as much driven by the head as the heart. What had always underpinned assimilation, both for its middle-class political architects and their working-class followers, was less some abstract love of France, and more the idea that it would radically transform Antillean society along the lines of an imagined republican equality. Much of its popular appeal, for example, derived from the idea that the extension of metropolitan labour laws would protect agricultural workers from exploitation by white planters. Military service, meanwhile, would, in creating a shared duty, supposedly break down social and racial hierarchies. That at least is the kind of the principle that they work on. But clearly there were other ways to achieve this transformation in Antillean society. And when the imperial relationship was seen to threaten rather than secure their future, it rapidly came under strain. The armistice arrived in November 1918 and was celebrated with all the pomp and fanfare we might expect. But the war, of course, had set in motion processes which would unfold over the years to come. And we only have time for one example, but it's a crucial one for understanding the interwar years. And it's a 31st of December 1922 law known in the Antilles as contingentement. So it's a set of quotas on Antillean rum exports to France. So this quota system was tied intimately to the war. Again, we can skip over the drier details of the legislation of the wartime metropolitan spirits market and pick up the story in 1919. The rum industry continued to boom in the aftermath of the war. Prices fluctuated massively from 1920 to 1921 due to the reconversion crisis and the Ministry of Munitions' release of all of its wartime stocks. And together, those shifts plunged the Antillean banking sector into crisis and led to the closure of a number of the new distilleries. But the situation was at least kind of outwardly rosy. The sugar factory owners banded together to form new lines of credit, and they ploughed millions of francs of their wartime profits into new equipment and machinery. From 1920 to 1922 alone, colonial rum imports into France rose by 78%. The wine producers of southern France were alarmed. Colonial rum, as they saw it, depressed prices in the consumption market, and more troublingly, thanks to its cheapness, rum was fast becoming the liqueur industry's rectified spirit of choice. The wine producers were a very dangerous enemy to have. The wine producing regions formed an immensely powerful bloc in the French Parliament. And it's fair to say that the wine producers themselves were a pretty prickly bunch with a proven record of using their political clout against their market rivals. The quota system then, which was pushed through suddenly at the end of December in 1922 by the 200-strong wine producer lobby in the French Parliament, reflected how easily, despite the lofty rhetoric and optimism of wartime, colonial interest was still to be sacrificed. The law placed limits on French imports of colonial rum. Martinique could now export just 80,000 hectolitres per year, and Guadeloupe 60,000 hectolitres. Any rum imported outside these quotas was to be taxed. The Antilles parliamentary representatives were powerless to resist. The response which came from the Antilles echoed what was going on in 1917 to 1918 with those kind of interventions by the French state. Camille Dain, the vice president of Guadeloupe's Conseil Général, summed up the mood in a protest meeting in Pointe-à-Pitre. He reminded them that it was at the government's own invitation that the rum industry had been able to expand as it had. The number of distilleries currently functioning was 81. If these establishments came to close, many heads of households would find themselves deprived of their livelihood. Yet no less than the wine producers in France, our populations have the right to life. It's a grave injustice to sacrifice a portion of the population of a single country to procure scandalous profits for another portion. It's a shameful regionalism which justifies us, too, in being regionalists in our own way. So here again, then, we have these ideas which burst out into the open in 1917 to 18. That Antillean patriotism had been betrayed, that France favoured its metropolitan and implicitly its white citizens, and that the imperial relationship put the island's economic future in jeopardy. Most steered clear of explicitly calling for a break. More common were vaguer references like Camille Dain's here, but some local politicians were reported as calling for separatism. Dissenting voices, which had hitherto been only marginal, now, for a very brief moment, began to sound much more mainstream. Le Bon Combat, the newspaper of Stéphane Rousseau, who would soon leave for Paris and take up with the Intercolonial Union alongside the likes of Ho Chi Minh and Messali Hadj, had been marginalized or Le Bon Combat and Rousseau had been marginalized for their stance on assimilationism, which it cast as a false hope for Antillians who would only ever be colonial citizens. Now, however, even Lara's Le Nouveliste began to sound more like Rousseau as it tackled the question of underdevelopment and crucially identified Antilleans as colonials rather than citizens. It's enough to read the newspaper articles and public brochures since the end of the war on the necessity of developing the colonies to understand that metropolitan industry, not wanting to be dependent on abroad, intends quite simply to take its raw materials from the colonial possessions. This is from the new release. But as soon as the colonies manufacture their own products, liable to compete with metropolitan products, the question changes tack, and they contest colonial producers' right to congest the market. So as long as copra from Oceania and peanuts from Senegal arrive at Marseille to serve in the fabrication of oils or soaps, not a voice is raised in protest in the metropole. But let these colonies keep the copra and the peanuts to make the oils and soaps there, and let these oils and soaps arrive at Marseille, it would be another story. The metropolitan producers would give a loud cry and demand restrictions or bans on colonial competition. So we have there this kind of, I guess, diagnosis really by Lara of the reality which is always laying behind the political economic relationship between France and its colonies. So this quota system then was just one example of a wider French imperial policy which aimed at extraction rather than evolution, the same type of policy, Lara warned, which had led to American independence from Britain. It's not enough, he continued to declare in official speeches or from the tribune in Parliament that colonial brothers shed their blood for the patrie, and this blood was the same color as that of white soldiers. It's necessary to treat them as French, accept them into French markets, the products they make, allow them to develop their industry, to prosper economically. That the quota system soon became immensely popular in the Antilles speaks to the strong pragmatist thread running through assimilationism and the wider debates about the future of empire. For all that it represented something of a retreat from protectionism, the quota system had unwittingly protective effects. Antillean producers were protected from the growing menace of cheap rum for Indochina and Madagascar, whose quotas were very small, and which had threatened a possibly fatal overproduction crisis. And the Antilles quotas, for their part, were by no means dangerously restrictive and promised to ensure a stable and remunerative price for Antillean rum. In 1923, months after the quota system had come into force, Henri Lemery again put forward a bill to turn the islands into overseas departments. And by the time of the May 1924 elections, Sever and Alcide Delmont were promising to, quote, unite our forces for the protection and improvement of the quota system, which is such an important factor in the prosperity of our colony. If economic dependence was the price of security for the island's monocultural economies, it was a price which many felt was worth paying in a time of global economic instability, and which called for an ever more secure political union with the mother country. Assimilationism emerged strengthened. Even amid the anxiety of early January 1923, Lara had remained cautious. Echoing many of those who had spoken at the Pointe-à-Pitre protest, he admitted that France had wrought real economic harm on the islands more than once in the past. But, he continued, if France could carelessly or callously destroy the Antilles economy, France was also the only thing capable of saving it. We who are 200,000 islanders lost on a grain of sand in the New World, we need a metropole. And here was an argument which would find its echoes throughout the interwar years. So to conclude very briefly, the islands of the British and French Caribbean, which entered the war in 1914, had different relationships with their imperial powers and were under the influence of very different political ideologies. And these naturally shaped the ways that empire was reimagined. But I think, and I hope I've shown, that we ought to think to bring kind of pragmatism and political economic thought into our understanding of Caribbean decolonization to a far greater degree than is generally done. Decades of pre-1914 economic neglect had not destroyed imperial patriotism, far from it. But by the time the war broke out, most of those whom we've encountered were willing to rapidly cast aside sentimentality when it came to questions of economic survival. These, in fact, were constitutive of imperial identity rather than opposed to it. Looking ahead, these questions will retain their importance. Imperial preference and the quota system in the French case, and particularly the latter, sucked the Caribbean into a closer state of dependence. In the British case, the Depression years were to be years of mass unrest among agricultural workers, among others, from which seeds a recognizable stage of the subsequent independence movements were to emerge. The quota system, extended to sugar in 1933, insulated the Antilles from the worst of the Depression. France remained a remunerative outlet for the monocultural island economies, while others around them struggled. And this, I think, has a kind of huge bearing on why it is that the two cases end up going in very different directions. The one towards a future as overseas departments and the other towards a future as independent nation states. So I'll wrap things up there. And if you have any questions, I'd love to hear them. But thank you for listening.
Okay, thank you very much, Mike. That was fantastic. Yeah, everyone's clapping in their hands and doing that. Now we got professors in the queue. But I was wondering if there was any master's student in the queue. The sort of turning up the heat on the master's students doesn't work on the Zoom as much as in person. But does anyone have a Ty? Do you have a question?
Hello.
Hi, Dara.
Hi, good to see you. I think the question I have, firstly, that was a really interesting talk and I really enjoyed it. Is that you've talked a lot of kind of how from the Caribbean, some of these kind of imperial things were viewed. I'm interested that, like, from, let's say, the perspective of London, what did they think about their colonies in the Caribbean? Because I know in some other places like Canada and South Africa, they were very big on these places need to unify and that will strengthen the empire. I mean, did they care what the West Indies were doing? Did they have an active hand in what was happening there, or they kind of just didn't really think about it much?
That's a super question. I think probably the nearest answer to the truth would be that they don't particularly care. What happens in the war years comes after a sort of a period of what we can think of as kind of neglect, to borrow from Christopher Taylor's work, where this turn to free trade really leads kind of interest and metropolitan sort of care and attention to divest from the Caribbean, along with investment in sugar. So Britain starts to get its sugar from Cuba, it starts to get its sugar from Germany, and it kind of has this period of turning away from the Caribbean, and they become what Disraeli refers to as sort of millstones round the neck of Britain, because they're no longer of economic value and therefore kind of no longer useful. And what then happens is that this produces sort of huge, I guess, a huge degree of social and economic crisis in the Caribbean, which culminates in 1897 with this royal commission being sent out to investigate, kind of what can we now actually do with these places? How can we plot a future for them? There's a really interesting section kind of buried within that report, which essentially admits that Britain has an ongoing obligation to the Caribbean because it created these islands as plantation colonies. It placed the majority of the population there, or their ancestors, as enslaved people, and that therefore Britain had a sort of ongoing obligation. That admission does not at all then play into kind of future policy towards the islands. In the build-up to the war, there is kind of absolutely nothing really, or very little done to kind of support their economies, or to kind of really think about ways of enacting forms of social reform or anything like that. And so all of the kind of debates which are going on in the Caribbean, in the British Caribbean during these years about kind of, will we be able to become part of a sort of reformed empire as a federal West Indian Dominion and stuff, it's all happening kind of parallel. They're picking up on things which people are saying in Britain when they're referring to other stuff largely. So, when Walter Long says that the empire has to become kind of more completely self-supporting, he's not really talking about kind of, we need to get more of our sugar from the Caribbean. But it's quite easy for them sitting out there to kind of think that this is, hey, these guys are talking about us. This is finally kind of the end of this 80-year period of neglect. So I suppose, yeah, my answer would be that there's not a huge amount of kind of metropolitan attention paid to them. It's very much a kind of dialogue of the deaf, in a way, the Caribbean speaking back to London, but never being heard.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that's really interesting. And I like the kind of divergence between Britain and France, where even France today is the country with the most time zones in the world, because it kind of, the tensions seem to be higher with all its colonies, but also seem to draw them close together, where Britain seemed to be kind of just say adieu and kind of that was it. So yeah, thank you.
Okay, grad students aren't off the hook yet, but we have so many professors in the queue. We got to start knocking professors out of the queue. So Cindy Ewing, you were first up.
Okay, great. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, wonderful. So thank you so much, Michael, for your talk. I really enjoyed your paper. I'm an assistant professor of history here, and I work on decolonization in Asia. So I really share your framing of thinking of the First World War as an accelerator of economic transformation. And so I wanted to make a comparison with another part of the British Empire, and that's India under the British Raj. And so, the war resulted in some clear winners and losers. So domestic manufacturing really rose as a result of the war, so mainly steel. But agricultural producers really suffered. So that was because of cash crops being requisitioned, grain being used to support the cavalry, for example. And so this in turn had an effect of creating a kind of segmentation of the labor force between those working in manufacturing and those in agriculture, which in turn affected the prospects for the independence movement. So the cities versus the countryside, those in agricultural laborers who were much more supportive of Gandhi and his movement versus those who might have worked for Tata Steel and were self-professed patriots of the British Empire. So is there anything similar to that that's happening in the Caribbean, where there's this kind of division within the potential anti-colonial movement as a result of the economic effects of the war? Thanks.
That's a really super question, so thank you for that. I would say that probably the big distinction is that most of these islands' economies are far less diversified than in the Indian case. So there, perhaps if there was a kind of significant manufacturing sector in a way, you might see that, but because in the case of somewhere like Barbados, it is essentially a kind of sugar monoculture. There are people who work on the plantations, and there are people who work in industries which kind of rely on the kind of wages being paid to plantation workers. So who work in commerce, directly connected to that, who work in kind of export trades, et cetera, et cetera. What you do see, I suppose, though, is a kind of, let's put this another way, the effects on the kind of Caribbean sugar economy are sort of twofold. There's the stuff that I've talked about, where the kind of high level stuff around prices and the effect that has on the structure of the production and so on. But there's also the way in which plantation economies, like the ones that the islands have, are reliant not just on the export of kind of a particular commodity, but also on the import of pretty much everything else. Like they produce one thing to send abroad, and they're reliant very much on importing everything else, particularly for kind of working people. They're heavily reliant on the import of saltfish, of rice, of other kind of staple foodstuffs, which, as you might imagine, during the war years, when shipping shortages creep in and that sort of thing, the cost of living rises tremendously. And so it becomes a kind of very volatile place socially. And in 1919, in the British Caribbean in particular, there's a kind of spate of kind of labor unrest, which has sort of quite significant political implications into the 20s in some of the islands. But I think, in that sense, maybe in the Caribbean, it's slightly different in that the economic effects of the war have the effect of sort of bringing together a kind of more coherent labor movement, to be honest, in some of the islands than has existed before. Before, it has been kind of very segmented and in a way kind of divided on, sort of segmented, but I would say that sort of looking forwards, the effect of the war is to sort of produce this more coherent labor movement, which then sort of gives birth to a more powerful sort of nationalist set of politics. I'm not sure I've kind of answered that particularly well, but it's a great question. I'll definitely be thinking more about that.
Great. Okay, Rob Fletcher.
Hello, hi. I think my question is similar in that it's about political economy and then the kind of political imaginaries that spiral out away from those. So I was also thinking about India, and I was thinking about how after 1918-19 you get a new generation of nationalists who are quite openly talking about the damaging legacies of free trade, and that this has been a particular kind. It gets articulated in a slightly different way. So my first part of the question was to see are there any actual connections between people writing in the West Indies and people writing in India around this topic? Is this a basis for actually building a kind of common line of attack against London? And then a related question is about dominion status. And does this actually appear in the mix as well as this idea of federation, which of course won't actually be realized until the 50s? Does dominion status get thrown around in the interwar period in the same way? Thanks.
Yeah, both really super questions, thanks. So the first one is quite simple. As far as I know, they're not talking about kind of India in relation to this sort of critique of the legacies of free trade. I think they reference India more in relation to this kind of emergent nationalist movement rather than in any kind of particular detail. It's a point of reference, but not one which they particularly develop all that much. Dominion status is a very important point to pick up on, and I think I should kind of mention that more explicitly in the course of the talk. So this Canada-West Indies Federation, for instance, it's intended that will form a kind of, super dominion, as it were, which, and even a kind of West Indian Federation is talked about as not in the sense of kind of creating something which is then going to stand on its own as a self-governing sort of independent federation. It's talked about very much as, taking a seat at in this imagined sort of commonwealth of nations is the language which they start to use, sort of appropriating that language from imperial reformists in the 20s and from the Balfour Declaration in 1926 and so on. So dominion status is really kind of very much at the core of how they're envisaging their kind of political future. A lot of the people that I've talked about today, the reason that they're kind of falling out of the book, I guess, is that it's the likes of Davson and so on who are, it's difficult really in a way to describe what they're doing as kind of anti-colonial, whereas there are kind of people who are in the book, I suppose, like Marichaud and Cipriani into the 20s and stuff, who are equally, they're mobilizing a kind of similar way of understanding the island's position in a global economy. But they're also yoking that to a kind of much more well-developed anti-colonial set of principles and kind of practices. And so basically, the answer to your question is dominion status is hugely important for people of very different political persuasions. And there are a whole kind of cast of people that I could have talked about today who are sort of picking up on it in much more kind of stridently sort of nationalist and anti-colonial ways.
That's really great. Thanks.
Okay, Erin Marie Holmes.
Hi, I want to say how much I enjoyed your talk. I'm a historian of Barbados, a third of my time, but I cut off neatly in the 1830s. So I really enjoyed hearing you talk about the 20th century because it really reflects a lot, and it tells me a lot about things that I've seen on Barbados, but not really been able to appreciate things about how the landscape changed. And so my question, I have two questions, one that connects to my own research and one just because this is really phenomenal project. I'm curious because one of the things that I came across in looking at plantation records in Barbados is that sort of at the beginning of the period that you're talking about, through the beginning of World War II, there seems to be this consolidation of land holding going on. And then after the war, they seem to be forming these limited companies that kind of consolidate that even further and take responsibility out of the hands of the planters. And so I'm curious about how this reorganization is being shaped both by the war context, but also thinking, I don't know if you've come across Larry Kessler's work. He did his PhD at Temple. He's working on Hawaiian plantations from the 1770s through the 20th century. And one of the things that he's talked about is how learning, how basically improving cultivation practices scientifically or redesigning commercial relationships allowed Hawaiian planters even before statehood to really kind of build relationships with the United States. And I'm wondering if there's any of that going on in Barbados. And then the selfish one, because I'm in the process of transcribing slave registers from Barbados from the 18 teens. And I know that a couple of years ago, the British Archives called attention to the fact that they hadn't finished paying reparations to slaveholders until 2015. And so I'm wondering if that that continued obligation there is driving any interest in Barbados in particular, and maybe the Caribbean more generally, because I know they're paying reparations in other places as well. So thank you for the talk, and thank you for talking so much too about the Canadian relationship, because it's amazing how it's shaped the hospitality industry there today.
Thank you so much for those questions. I think I'll take them sort of in the order that they came. So in terms of the sort of, I guess, 20th century shifts in the structure of sugar in Barbados, you're absolutely right to say there's this kind of consolidation of landholding during this period, and that's got a number of factors behind it. One, I think, is the prosperity that they enjoyed during the war years is very fleeting, and with imperial preference, they're able to kind of limp along for most of the 20s and 30s, but really most people are operating at a loss, or kind of scraping by during this period. And so what you get is a lot of kind of the smaller estates starting to go out of business and being bought up by kind of the larger ones. And you also get the introduction, or more of an introduction, of these central factories where you, rather than having kind of everyone having their own mill, as it were, there's a central factory which then lots of plantations just send their cane straight to. So that's one aspect of it. Another is that Barbados, I think uniquely in the British Caribbean, or at least among the kind of main sugar producers, has its own sort of, I think it's a chancery court, which basically means that if you go bankrupt, then it's sold there rather than in London. So a lot of the other places, somewhere like Jamaica, a lot of the bankrupt estates get bought up by metropolitan or or just foreign owners. Whereas in Barbados, things tend to stay more within the kind of local sort of merchant planter nexus, which has emerged during these years. So that's actually kind of maybe the part of the answer to the second one, which is that like links to the US are kind of less so during the period that I look at, perhaps, I think, because this merchant planter elite in Barbados still retains such a strong hold over the industry and over kind of the land holding as a whole. The main change really actually in these years is that immigrants coming back from Panama and Central America, or kind of remittances flowing back and then immigrants coming back, are able to kind of buy up land that previously sort of there was no way they could afford. And so there is a kind of shift in land holding there, but mainly, yeah, it's consolidation by sort of local planters and elites, I think. And then in terms of the last question, I just want to make sure I get this right. Do you mean, is there kind of renewed interest now in Barbados and kind of Caribbean history?
I mean more during your period. Is there this interest because of this financial connection? And I know that so many of the Barbadian slaveholders in particular, they retain the land, even though they are forced to emancipate the enslaved people. And so how does that, but they all become absentees and use them as like vacation houses.
Yeah, well, I mean, I imagine you may have seen in the last kind of month or so, there's been some talk in the UK of how a member of parliament over here still owns kind of plantation land in Barbados as a kind of relic of his ancestral family's wealth. But in the period that I look at, it's actually in the 30s really that this stuff starts to really come about, and it's an interesting convergence, I think, and one that I sort of hope to explore a bit in the book, between a more sort of thoroughgoing critique of the plantation economy as a sort of way of organizing the Caribbean economy on the one hand, and then anti-colonial writing by the likes of Eric Williams and C.L.R. James, which is sort of focusing on a very similar topic and kind of actually drawing remarkably similar conclusions and comparisons and so on. And I wonder whether, I suppose I wonder whether there's a connection between the two, that people sort of seem to be discovering these things at the same time. So to stay on the Barbados example, Grantley Adams, who, kind of, for those of you who aren't familiar with the sort of minutiae of Barbadian politics in the 20th century, is kind of, the Thomas Jefferson of Barbados. He develops this kind of this kind of anti-colonial project, which is designed around dismantling the plantation in its entirety. He wants to see a kind of Barbados of smallholders with no one owning more than about 50 acres of land, no one able to kind of farm an entire plantation, that sort of thing. And I just find it interesting that at the very moment that you're getting stuff like that happening there, and similar things going on in Jamaica and similar things going on in Trinidad, that you also get, William having gone from Trinidad to, in the 20s, from Trinidad to Oxford, thinking in very similar ways. So I guess the book project is really looking at kind of how do these forms of political economic thought develop, and what are these kind of traditions which might lie behind some of the sort of more famous, celebrated types of anti-colonialism that emerged from the Caribbean. That's probably a kind of very sort of tangential answer to your question, but
it was an excellent answer, and especially because every time I've been there, I study buildings, so I look for old buildings on Barbados, and every time it's just dominated by these old factory buildings that just seem really incongruous. So that actually was really helpful. Thank you so much, and good luck.
yes.
Okay, we have two more questions. Then I want to, if it's not too late, I'll see if I can sneak one in. But oh my God, it's like closing time for the pubs over there. So let's show some mercy to our speaker. But we got another student question from Mary Grace, and then Chris Deutsch, and then we'll see if I'll wrap it up, or if we'll let Mike go to sleep. Mary Grace, you're up. You're muted.
Oh, thank you so much for your talk today. Sarah Jolly wanted me to tell you hi. She's my roommate, and she couldn't attend the talk, unfortunately. She had class, but she just wanted to say hi. And my question today, I kind of wanted to put a gender analysis on this conversation and talk about like what's going on with the centralization, and then just the ongoing idea of women's rights, or kind of in citizenship, and how that fits into this conversation. And so if you could just expand on those ideas for that. I know it's pretty broad, but I'd just like to hear more.
Absolutely. So yeah, kind of painfully aware that I've given a sort of very a talk based around a sort of very narrow subset of kind of elite male Caribbean opinion. Let's think, how would I answer this? I suppose I don't know why I'm struggling so much, that I've written an entire article about French Caribbean women in the First World War, so I shouldn't be struggling to frame this as much as I am. I think the one possible avenue to go down with this is to sort of think about the type of labor that women do on, or the type of plantation labor that women do on sugar plantations in the Caribbean during this period. There is a kind of a strict, or pretty strict, division of labor between kind of between the tasks that men and women are sort of expected to carry out. So, men are cane cutters, women gather the cane and bundle it up, ready to be sort of carted off to the factory. One thing which you see during these years in the French Caribbean in particular, where there's conscription, is that you suddenly lose kind of an entire generation, as it were, of the people who cut the cane, and so you get a kind of blurring in a way of this the usual kind of division of labor, and women's labor roles change quite dramatically. The article that I've written is I guess more focused around the citizenship stuff that you mentioned. Is based around separation allowances, so payments which are paid to soldier dependents in return for kind of essentially in return for their male relatives' military service. And I guess one of the things that article hopefully, or at least tries to show, is the way that French Caribbean women who are obviously denied the vote during these years and until the 1940s, but are deeply involved in politics in ways which aren't accounted for just by kind of voting. The way that they kind of mobilize their importance to these local politicians' kind of constituencies to leverage their own kind of claims to separation allowances, to leverage kind of more money, to the extent really that kind of pressure that gets put on these politicians in Martinique and Guadeloupe gets brought up in debates in the French Parliament, where they have kind of representatives sitting. The laws ultimately get kind of liberalized so that it becomes easier to claim this type of money. So I guess that all of that is by way of saying that the war creates sort of opportunities. This probably isn't necessarily the best way to kind of think of it, but it creates opportunities for women to expand their kind of political terrain and to sort of leverage the type of political activities they're already involved in, but it doesn't lead in either British or the French Caribbean to a kind of sustained suffrage movement. The type of politicians and kind of commercial figures and whatnot that I was talking about today are very kind of patriarchal in their politics. Even the sorts of anti-colonialism that develops into the 30s is very much kind of premised around a sort of patriarchal vision of the sort of male breadwinner family holding small plots of land. So no huge gains, but kind of lots of interesting political battles being fought. And say hi to Sarah for me, please, as well.
Thank you.
Okay, Chris Deutsch.
Thank you very much for this talk. I'll try not to open a big can of worms, but I'm thinking about how this, unsurprisingly, intersects with my own work. So I do similar things with food, political economy, and post-war US development and improvement. And to be that guy, to bring this back to US context, I'm struck when I read pre-World War II USDA documentation about how important sweetness and independence were. So like, there's a book I'll never write about the US quest for sugar independence, where things don't have to cross federal borders, but just state borders to get from one point to the other. Hawaii, Colorado's beet fields, all that stuff. High fructose corn syrup. Which makes me wonder about your project. And it seems like this might be a bit of a outside your area. So hopefully maybe a quick answer is all you need. But do you see yourself using this stuff, because you're wanting a home for it, would be settling it within the kind of the global international kind of political economy of sweetness trading after the early 1900s leading into World War II, and like what different governments are trying to do to make sure their citizens can eat all the sugary treats they want, be it a kid eat a candy or a manufacturer using it for industrial purposes or home baked goods or what have you?
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, thank you for that question. I think you should write that book on sugar independence. I would love to read that. I suppose the easiest answer is that like that is maybe kind of one of the threads that runs through the book, and which in a way structures the comparison. So some of you may be familiar with Elizabeth Heath's work on sugar in Guadeloupe and wine growing in the south of France. She does this comparison, which is kind of really brilliantly conceived, I think, where it's in part a sort of direct comparison between the two cases, but the sort of the pace and the rhythm of it is really set by the development in the kind of global economy and the onset of the late 19th century depression and that sort of thing. And so I think the book that I'm writing in a way tries to do something kind of similar, in that the thread which runs through the center of it is the kind of development and turmoil of world sugar markets from the kind of late 19th to the mid 20th centuries, and the way that Britain and France both choose to kind of opt in and opt out of various internationalist efforts to kind of sort that out and make sure that they have, as you say, kind of access to a continuous supply. So, you know, the Brussels Convention in 1902, and then the International Sugar Agreement in 37, I think. Things like that kind of crop up quite prominently, because they're also things that the people that I look at from an anti-colonial thought perspective are super interested in. I guess like one of the things I sort of am trying to show with the book is how anti-colonial thought is really obsessed with sugar in these years. You know, because it's so kind of important to these places' economy, it becomes a kind of really central axis on which they imagine different forms of political future. And so, yeah, I think kind of hopefully my work will kind of be in conversation with others who are sort of thinking about how, you know, as you put it, kind of the US gets its supply of sugar or kind of other agricultural commodities. But for, you know, for me, it's very much Britain and France and kind of the impact which their decisions then have on, you know, this kind of small population, but you know, I think kind of important population of people who make a living off this stuff. So yeah, I hope that covers it.
And actually, Mike, so we can detain you, because my question is very similar to that, or what you were just talking about. Is this a volatility of the political economy in this period, and it's bouncing around like a pinball, and it has all kinds of unanticipated political consequences, as well as economic ones. And I guess my question, so with that being said, is you started the paper off, didn't you, talking about the Great War and the global history of the Great War, and you know, even when we think we're globalizing the Great War, we're still making outside of Europe a periphery or an adjunct to the story. And so I guess, you know, thinking about it, is the Great War even really, I mean, maybe it's a moment of particular volatility, but as you were just saying, I mean, the problems with the sugar industry and the global competition and the emergence of the beet sugar, that's a story that goes into the late 19th century, and it carries right through. And then if you're talking about some of these sharp downturns, which leads to a sort of crisis of the imperial economic order and unanticipated changes in trade policy and preference, I mean, that story of the 1920s and the Great Depression, the forgotten depression of, you know, the sharp downturn right after the war, which it's devastating to a whole host of actors, and including some of the aforementioned manufacturing interests. So I guess I like that, and I like. It seems like you've really decentered the Great War when we put it like that. But here's my question: is what would you say to the skeptic? What would you say to the critic that said, "No, wait a second, you've gone too far here. The Great War itself is a colossal crisis, and not just of politics, but of culture and identity, and those things need to be brought out into the story. And yes, it's problematic methodologically to try to map them onto developments outside of Europe, but it can be done. And the Great War is something special. It's something different. It's not just part of this story. It's great. Yeah. I mean, great, not in a good way, but you know what I'm saying. So I guess I don't know if that made sense, but I think you're nodding, so you get my point. What would you say to someone who says actually the Great War now is kind of just another series of volatile moments in political economy, when surely it's something more than that?
Yeah, so I mean, it's not my intention by all means to put First World War historians out out of business, so to speak. I think what I would say a couple of things to that, I suppose. One is that the story that I'm telling is one which I kind of understand is necessarily a sort of partial rendering of what the First World War is, and even is to the Caribbean, right? I don't want to suggest that kind of just because I'm not so interested in those who went overseas to fight and then came back, that doesn't necessarily mean that I don't think that that stuff is important. I just think that it has thus far kind of had an outsized presence in how we understand the sort of political implications of the war. This idea that kind of veterans are sort of radicalized at the front and then come back to sort of lead the fight for independence. I think if you look at it, that's actually not kind of what happens at all. And so I suppose sort of one element of what I'm saying is that the story that I tell kind of is a necessarily sort of partial one. But I think the other side, I guess, to that is to say that the type of politics which develops in both the kind of British and French Caribbean, or at least the type of sort of formal electoral politics that kind of interests me in my research at the moment, is sort of notably uninterested in kind of matters of culture, at least in the sense of sort of trying to unpick what it might mean to be both kind of British and Jamaican at once, for instance. There's much less of that type of kind of critical reflection than comes later. What there is a kind of uptick, perhaps, in the types of sort of high Victorian jingoism that characterizes the sort of the social elite of these islands, and that I think kind of is reinforced and maybe does need to become part of the story I tell slightly more. This talk today was probably I slightly regretted using the term pragmatism, because I think it underestimates the way in which sort of people have genuine investments in what it is to be kind of British. And I think probably or in fact definitely looking forward, I would need to incorporate slightly more about sort of what the war does to people's kind of cultural renderings of Britishness. But I don't want to concede too much ground. I think this is still principally a sort of an interesting moment in the history of the sugar economy, and I'm going to keep on pursuing that, I think.
I think you should stand your ground. I think it was fantastic.